Hi, my name is Brent and welcome to my shop. I have recently built a new workbench. As you can see, I am missing the planing stop and some dog holes for some holdfasts. But before I got to that, I thought the next important thing to make would be a chair to sit in. So the project that we're going to be working on is a stool. Now, what we're going to be using to make this project is some 2x12 lumber from the home center. So you might be asking yourself, why would we use 2x12 lumber when we can probably just get away with 2x4s, as we're going to be ripping these down into some smaller legs, as well as being able to glue a panel together. The main reason why is going to be the grain. As we can take a look in the end, the grain on a 2x4 is not going to be very nice. These tend to be from younger trees. So as you can see, we've got the pith right here, and the grain is basically going all the way around in a circle. When we take a look at the 2x12, the same pith would be about here, but we've got this nice long radius of the grain. What this is going to mean is that we're going to be able to take strips out of the outer portions of the wood in order to be able to get more rift-sawn grain. Now, rift-sawn grain is going to be where the grain is at a 45-degree angle to the faces, and it means that we're not going to have any of this flat sawn wood showing either on the top or around the edges. Another important benefit of using 2x12 lumber over 2x4 lumber or 2x6 or 2x8 is that we're going to be able to cut around these knots that we see in this piece here. As you can tell with the 2x4 lumber, it's got knots throughout, and it's going to be really hard to be able to cut strips that aren't going to have any of those blemishes. Now, this is going to create some waste, but given the price point for this lumber, it's much better to have waste out of something like this than, a walnut or a maple. You're going to not feel as bad by having to have some of this end up in your scrap pile, and you could always use it later to make jigs. So the first thing that we're going to do is mark out our pieces for our seat blanks, our legs, and our stretchers. I'm going to make sure to keep each of these pieces an inch longer than the final dimensions needed. Next, we're going to bring our board over to the miter saw and break down the components. Over at the table saw, we're going to rip down the pieces for the seat blank. We're going to use 4 pieces for the seat blank, and I'm going to rotate the board whenever I put it back through the table saw so that I keep that rip-sawn grain. For the legs and the stretchers, I'm going to rip those down to the same width as the thickness of the 2x material. I did this so that I will be able to get a square piece of stock to make the legs and the stretchers from. After ripping down all the necessary pieces for the stool, I started with milling the pieces for the seat blank. I ran each piece through the jointer twice on one of the faces, and then rotated that 90 degrees in order to get a square side. I then finished milling the lumber for the seat blank over at the planer. You should be able to get about 1.25 inches thickness out of 2x material. At the table saw, I cleaned up the final edge on the boards for the seat blank. I left these about 1/8 of an inch oversized. At the bench, I laid out the pieces for the seat blank to get the desired grain orientation. I marked out this orientation with a triangle. I brought the pieces back over to the jointer to clean up the edges before the glue up. I flipped over the pieces while running them through the jointer to ensure that there would be a nice tight fit in case my fence is not perfectly 90 degrees. Back at the bench, I laid out the pieces for the seat blank and made sure that there were no gaps in the joints. The seat blank is now ready to be glued together. I put glue on one face of each of the joints and spread it to make sure that there was good coverage. When clamping the seat blank, I also made sure that it was nice and flat and wasn't cupping. After letting the seat blank cure overnight, I removed the clamps and rough sanded the surfaces to remove any glue squeeze out. I then brought the seat blank over to the table saw to make it square. This will make it easier to mark out the mortises for the legs. With the seat blank complete, I began working on the legs and the stretchers. 2 of the sides were run through the jointer to make them square. I then brought these pieces over to the planer to make them square by running them each with 2 passes, turning them 90 degrees between each pass. Back at the bench, I marked out the mortises for the stretchers. The stretchers on the perpendicular sides of the legs are going to be at different heights. It's important at this stage to double and triple check that you have the proper orientation for the stretchers. Before turning the legs, I drilled the mortises for the stretchers. I used a drill press and a jig to hold the legs at the same angle as the splay of the stool. With the mortises for the stretchers drilled, I could then bring the legs over to the lathe and begin turning them. I used a crescent wrench to make sure that I had the desired diameter of both the leg and the tenon for the seat. After a dry assembly to check for proper fit, I then glued the legs and the stretchers together. After the legs and the stretchers had cured, I removed them from the seat plank and, using a circle jig, cut out the shape for the stool's seat. I then brought the seat over to the bandsaw to cut away the majority of the waste. With a template bit in my router, I then cleaned up the remaining waste from the seat with a couple of passes. I then rounded over the edges of the seat with a 1/4 inch round over bit. With the seat complete, I sanded the underside, as this section would be hard to get to after the legs had been glued in place. I could then glue and clamp the legs onto the seat and leave it overnight to cure. With the legs glued to the seat, I brought the stool over to my table saw, and using a pencil and a shim, I scribed a line onto the bottom of each of the legs. I could then cut the legs so that it would rest flat on the floor. To make sure that the legs wouldn't blow out after being inevitably dragged across the floor, I used my sander to round over the feet. With my sander, I sanded the top of the seat and touched up the roundovers. I sanded the stretchers and the legs by hand, making sure to take extra time around the joint between the legs and the stretchers to ensure that there was not any remaining glue squeeze out and that the transitions were smooth. With the stool sanded, I was now able to start finishing. I did the finishing in my house as opposed to in my shop because the outside temperature was about negative 30 degrees Celsius. I did not want to have to keep my shop heat running while the finish cured. For the finish, I used an equal parts mixture of spar urethane, boiled linseed oil, and mineral spirits. I did 3 coats of this finish, leaving about 24 hours for the finish to cure between each coat. And between each coat, I also did a scuff sand by hand with 220 grit sandpaper. Well, now that this project's all done, we can put it in its place and have a nice comfortable seat to do work at this new bench. This is my first time making one of these videos. I'm hoping to be able to keep doing this in the future. If you enjoyed it, I would love to have you back. So please like or subscribe, leave me some comments. I'll make sure to get back to you in those. As you can tell, nothing in my shop is super fancy. I don't have fancy tools. But what I'd like to be able to do is to be able to build average projects for the average person. And I hope you guys would like to come along for that as well. So I will see you in the next one.